Right, everyone. I think we'll get started now. Good morning. Good morning if you are here in Sydney. Hello and welcome to the Committee for Sydney Global webinar for the year. It's great to be back, bringing you some of the best thinkers and ideas from around the world. This series of online events that we have branded CFS Global is one of those things from the forced experiment of COVID that we actually quite like and are hoping to continue. We're able to hear from people all over the world and learn from them and apply their ideas to things here in Sydney. So I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the committee. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, wherever that is for you. I'm on the land of the Gadigal, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to just acknowledge the people of the cities of Ukraine right now, and I think it feels really strange to all of us to be here in the safety of our lives in Sydney, just going about our business while we are watching the people of an emerging democracy being invaded. And it is a real reminder about the fragility of cities. Something we are reminded of far too often. But thank you for taking time away from the doom scrolling to join us and take a step back. To talk about cities. Today, we are pleased to welcome historian Ben Wilson, joining us from outside London. For a talk based on his book, Metropolis, A History of the City, Humankind's Greatest Invention. Ben is the author of 6 books, including What Price Liberty, Empire of the Deep, and most recently, Heyday, The Dawn of the Golden Age. Major independent public intellectual. And I read this book, Metropolis, over the summer, and it is really a wonderful read. It calls to mind Mumford's City and History, or Peter Hall's Cities and Civilization, a tour across thousands of years of urban history that is attempting not just to describe what the cities were like, but to distill something of the essence of the form, to learn something about how cities work, which is to say, the vessel that most of humanity lives in. Ben will make some remarks, and then we'll have a discussion. We are so pleased you could join us, Ben. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be with you this morning, and I share your remarks, especially about Ukraine, which feels frighteningly close to some of the themes I pick up in the book, which is about urban resilience. But I want to start the talk talking about 2 places where I went when I was researching this book, which is a globe-spanning, time-spanning history of urbanization. And I like unlikely places. So I'm going to start in an unlikely place, which is an old railway sidings in Berlin, which maybe some of you will have heard of, especially if you're interested in urban ecology. It's called the Sudkerland. It's a leftover space. It's a victim of geopolitics. It was a victim of the Cold War. And a very busy railway terminus was abandoned. And today it is an example of what happens when a part of a city is left fallow, when it's left to itself. It's a place of kind of unexpected, amazing kind of flourishing of nature. It contains within it more biodiversity than a place outside the city, although this is very much in the center of Berlin. It's a place where a forest has emerged, a place that is full of wildlife, fungi, rare plants, grasslands in a tiny, tiny space. And it was a place that was, like a lot of things we value about cities, was contested. It was going to be built upon. but people fought back. It flourishes because it's been left alone. It's a marginal space where interesting things happen. And that kind of reminds me of one of the key things about cities, which is the unexpected, the spontaneity of cities that I think is sort of represented in the sort of flourishing of nature within an intensely urban environment. The second place, which I visited as part of the book, is in Lagos in Nigeria, one of the greatest cities in the, one of the fastest growing, largest mega cities in the world. And this place in Lagos, Tiba Computer Village, to me was one of the most extraordinary places I visited as an urban center. Today it's one of the biggest computer markets in Africa. It's a normal African market, street market. It was started in the late 1990s when some typewriter operatives or repair people made the jump into computers, and it formed this kind of clustering effect of people moving there, collaborating, sharing information, and bit by bit building up this computer market, which is now today has a turnover in the billions of dollars every year. People come from all over Africa. When Huawei and other companies tried to break into the African market, they couldn't open showrooms. They had to compete on the streets. And this place of this sort of intense activity of piled up computer mouses, cables, old laptop terminals, people repairing computers and phones, is this dynamic market where people come from all over Nigeria and serve apprenticeships. There's a court system, there's a system of governance, an informal policing system. And now this is a kind of this place I went to and sort of soaked in this kind of incredible kind of packed atmosphere of tens of thousands of people collaborating on information, sharing information, competing, seemed to me in a way to kind of sum up or distill a bit of, what urban history is about. And just like the Sudkerland in Germany, it's the kind of going off the beaten track, finding these places in cities that are kind of, places of sort of unexpected flourishing. The informal side of cities seems to me the most interesting place. And it took me back, in my thoughts at the time and in my way of thinking about cities to the very first city, this sort of bridge of time of almost 7,000 years from the first city, Uruk, which was in Mesopotamia, which is southern Iraq. In 4000 BC, the beginnings of our kind of urban journey starts in a marsh, in a very odd kind of terrain for city building. It's not a place of agriculture. It's a place of a mix of ecology. It's an ecosystem that in turn supports a city. These cities started in a terrain that was unpredictable. It was prone to flooding. It was prone to villages being swept away. But at the same time, it provided a bounty of food, a kind of an amazing kind of cornucopia of resources. And it seemed to the people that lived there that this was the kind of the origin stories of the world, this intersection of sea and land, of desert and places of fecundity. This was a place where the kind of the wellspring of humanity began, and to celebrate that place or to worship at that place was the beginning of cities, in the sense that it became a place of permanence, a place of worship, a place where the gods lived, and people clustered around this place, and it became unique in the history of the world at the time as a place of high density, a place where, like a Tiba Computer Village or any kind of urban center that is successful in history, a place where people cluster together and share knowledge. And it's that sort of density of living that gives birth to a kind of an amazing inventiveness in Uruk 7,000 years ago, as a city forms, as climate change makes the marsh waters disappeared. It became a kind of a terrain that suited cities, and marshlands are where cities begin. These deltas and estuaries in China, the Niger, in Africa, in San Lorenzo, in Central America. They're all marshy terrains that seem to support urban life. It's not agriculture that gives birth to it. It is these kind of big curious places. But suffice to say, this kind of inventiveness that happens in Uruk, this clustering together of people we begin the amazing breakthroughs in human life. This was a place called the Smithy of the gods. It was a place where people made breakthroughs in art and inventiveness, and that leads to the complexities of human society. We see the beginnings of writing, the first writing in human history, the beginning of the wheel, the beginning of money, the beginning of financial transactions, of debt, and some of the things that are less positive. My book is not a celebration of urban life. It dwells as much on the darkness as it does on the light. This is where we see the beginnings of kinship, of armies, and slavery, all bound up in this kind of very fast-changing urban society. City is a place of exchange of information, the collective brain power that comes together. So I think these are features of cities that sort of echo through history. That Uruk was a place of continual building and rebuilding, a mounding up of history in very short periods of time, as this kind of entrepreneurial and inventiveness kind of took hold, and people were exploring and living lives that were very different from anything that had gone before. It was a truly remarkable place in human history, now given up to the sands. But at the time, the beginning, the Metropolis, which means in Greek mother city, Uruk was the mother city of them all. It spawned competitors, rivals, collaborators, empires of interconnected city-states that all shared a kind of reverence for place, a place where the gods lived. The gods lived in the cities. This was a divine creation. The people that lived in cities were lucky. And I start the book talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Uruk and about Uruk in a way. This is the first epic poem in human history. And it is about the tension between countryside and city, between what is a natural way to life and what is an artificial way to life. And to cut a long story short about the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh feels like this is an artificial way of life. He goes in search of immortality. He travels to the ends of the world. He goes on adventures. And he can't cheat death. The lesson of his epic journey is that the city is the place where human knowledge is encoded. It is a place where immortality is found through the walls he builds for the city, the tablets of clay that he inscribes. And it's this sense of permanence, this way that information can be transferred down the ages. And that, to my mind, is this proximity of living, this intimacy of living in a dense urban environment starts this revolution in thought and this ability, this incredible kind of energies that well up, this dynamism that's contained within the city. What I'm sort of talking about here in referring to the Sudkerland in Berlin, or Tiba Computer Village in the modern day megacity of Lagos in Uruk, is that urban life is messy. It's this sort of spontaneity of interactions between people, which is at the heart of urban life and can't be planned for. Another example I would move on to is Athens, which was also a spatially messy place. We think of it as the place of the Parthenon, of kind of marble and grandeur, but visitors to Athens were amazed at the jumbled up and the kind of the twisting alleyways and kind of the sort of maze of streets, the labyrinth that was Athens. The messiness extended to its public spaces. The word in Greek for to speak in public is very similar to the word to shop, and that kind of expresses the agora in Athens as a place where you could go and buy pears and plums and damsons. You could go and talk about the gossip of the town. You could take part in legal proceedings, talk about the public life of the city, participate in its public life. That was the heart of the polis, and was very unique in urban history. We move away from those Mesopotamian ancient cities that were structured around religion and public spaces as being sacred. The public spaces as being this kind of mix of the public and the private. You know, the saying in Athens went, if you don't have any public business, you don't have any business being in the city. This is a landscape of democracy, a public space which is about life and living, and a mixing, a jumbling up, a blending of all the different functions of a city, the things you do for pleasure, the things you do to be a public citizen. This is a dramatically kind of revolutionary, radical public space. And this was the public space that the public spaces, the kind of labyrinth of the city that Socrates went to. He didn't go to institutions. This was off the books. This was the informal side of the city that he enjoyed going to, a place of the non-citizens, the aliens to Athens, the people who brought knowledge from elsewhere and interacted, you know, in the sort of less salubrious parts of the city, with the places that Socrates feasted on. They were the cities. This is the place of cosmopolitanism in the city, and a sort of celebration of the intimacy of the city, that people led a face-to-face lifestyle. And that was at the heart of the polis, the public life. What it was to be a political person was to be a city person. We find that again. I locate the next part of the story of cities in Rome, but they're outside the idea of the forum and the Rome we know from the mythology, and locate it in the bathhouses and places where people interact again outside formal structures. You know, the soul of the city was in its bathhouses, where sort of public nakedness, public interaction was an egalitarian kind of thing, where people could mix. And it was a kind of gift of the city magnets to the people, to give them places, these bathhouses of immense grandeur. But it was at the heart of this kind of sociability, this intimacy, this bodily intimacy. Athens talked about love of city, but he didn't use it in the way that we talk about how we love our countries or our cities or, you know, our communities. He talked about it in an erotic way. His love was an erotic love. It was a love of intimacy, of being part of something that was bigger than yourself and interacting in that. And I think that that idea of this kind of messy city, the city outside it, is really what I'm talking about. You find it again repeated in the Islamic city of the 8th, 9th centuries, of cities that have become so congested that at the end of the kind of the Roman grid pattern and the beginning of the souk, a kind of extended marketplace where marketing and the public and religious life of the city were again jumbled up. And I tell that story through food. My chapter on ancient or the medieval Baghdad is one of people interacting and taking pleasure in food. Something that we're very familiar with street food was key to the kind of the life of the city. And I talk of stories of caliphs who kind of don the disguise of a common person and go purely to eat the kind of amazing street food that a city like Baghdad provided, because it was the kind of crossroads of the world, where foods and spices and sort of tasty ingredients come. We're talking about this sort of the idea of the city as a place of sensuality, a place of kind of luxury, a place that's very different and kind of outside the kind of the kind of the normal life. The minority of people who enjoyed the city had access to the intimacy it provided, the intimacy of the exchange of ideas, the exchange of food, sex, beverages. The sociability of cities was so kind of key to cities, and that only really comes from mess, from what I talk about spatial mess, not unhygienic places, but spatially messy places of of informal interaction. And I tell that part of the story again in the coffee houses of London in the 17th and 18th centuries. This was another transition point for cities, that the coffee house provided a place that wasn't public and nor was it private. It was somewhere in between. It was a commercial place where anyone who had a coin in their pocket could come and mix. And coffee houses have a dynamic and important influence on London's kind of rise to greatness, because it was a place outside the institutions of the royal court or the courts of law or the universities. Here was a new space where people could interact and exchange news. Here's a place where journalism really begins, because it's a place that connects people. It connects the businessmen and financiers of the city with scientists, courtiers and politicians. It's a place of lectures. It's a place where science meets the commercial revolution, and that kind of exchange of knowledge outside any kind of formal institution. It's a networking effect that over a cup of coffee. We're used to now caffeine being a kind of lifeblood of the city, but it kind of really was in the 17th century. This mixing again of the public and private, and we see out of that, we see institutions like Lloyd's insurance, the dominant kind of insurance market in the world that underpins the beginning of modern capitalism, happens in a coffee house. The beginning of the stock market happens in a coffee house. This place where people can kind of mix pleasure and business in a dynamic way seems to me to be what makes cities tick. You find the same thing replicated in the European continental cafe. When London becomes a bit more exclusive, the continental cafes of Europe provide that same kind of public space. You find the same kind of spatial messiness in a place like New York, which kind of replicated the free market in a way. The way I tell it is, in this book, is the meeting of the movie camera and the skyscraper come along at exactly the same time, and it sort of celebrates this kind of new technologies, and it creates a kind of a spatially messy place, which is what New York was, a place where people were sort of duking it out for light and air and stealing light and air from their neighbors by building big buildings. And it seemed to mirror a kind of a corporate skyline where the kind of the market was unleashed. New York, the point of talking about New York is this place of kind of messiness, was the place that, of course, Le Corbusier, the great city planner, went and saw it and wanted to tear it down. He didn't see it as a city of the future. He saw it as a place that was badly in need of a demolition crew to knock it down and create these great kind of crystal towers in the sky that would be surrounded by foliage, the new city of the 20th century. As he was writing, it was the city that Fritz Lang, the filmmaker who made Metropolis, saw and created this dystopia of kind of greed for people pushing into the sky, this kind of messy city that imprisoned people beneath it. And that, again, is the second part of my theme I'm trying to develop here, which is this tension throughout history between what is really productive in cities, which is the spontaneity, the choice in the chance for random encounters, for meeting people, the things that we see in Otiba Computer Village, which is, this kind of messy place that is sort of brings forth entrepreneurialism. And it's, there's this sort of tension in history between people who want to clean up the city. Le Corbusier saw the city as being imprisoned by its past. Robert Moses, his disciple in New York to a large extent, said the only way to reform a city is to enter it with the meat cleaver and slash it down and start again. And we've always throughout history as well, because the city has sparked so many changes, so much kind of acceleration in human history, it has to be good, but it also brings out our vices. It is a place of dark corners, danger, and vice, a place that's radically different from anywhere else, much more kind of, advanced, but also kind of vice-ridden than anywhere else. Corbusier sort of turned, he taps into that instinct to try and bring perfection to the city, which goes back to the time of Uruk. The very first cities were designed to be places that brought order to a fundamentally disorderly world. Early cities, strikingly, in every continent in which they developed around the plans of the cosmos. They followed the outlines of the stars. They tried to find a divine order and bring it to a chaotic world. This is a sort of urban planning based on cosmology, and it's an instinct that I think that kind of existed throughout history. The other kind of Babylonian, or the Mesopotamian city that follows in a direct line from Uruk is Babylon, the city that gives its name to urban disorder, urban vice. A polyglot place, a place where people came from all around the known world and created this huge city that was a byword for its detractors, for all the ills of urban life, because it was a Babel. It was a place of many languages, of confusion, a profoundly unnatural place. And of course, it has a starring role in the Hebrew Bible, because it was where the Jews were taken in captivity from Jerusalem to this confusing place they didn't want to be in. And it gets written in. Remember, the Bible, the beginning of the Bible is a garden. The beginning for the Mesopotamians, the beginning of history, the beginning of the divine plan of the city. For the Judeo-Christian tradition, the beginning is a garden, and the city is an act of rebellion against God, and then it is God's punishment for us. It is a place of punishment for the Jews. And that kind of fear and hatred of the city, the rejection of the city, is one of those tensions that goes through history, that rejection of mess and complexity. Plato, who rejected Athens, wanted to create rational cities based on grid plans, on zoning. He was part of a kind of tradition that followed the fall of democracy in Athens, which was to create cities of control, where public space was once again regulated, where cities could be controlled through architecture, where people could be made better through better cities, where you could divide the functions of the city. No more would you have the glorious jumble of Athens. You would have it segregated into zones. You find that, the followers of that, the Romans were the great builders of the grid system. You find it with Leonardo da Vinci, who conceptualized the great perfected plan city. Christopher Wren, who wanted London to be transformed into a city of circulation rather than a city of kind of tortuous mazes. You find it again in the 19th century with the rejection, for good reason, of the industrial city and its mess and pollution, with the City Beautiful movement, the idea of garden cities, and its corollary, the beginning of suburbia, the rejection of the city. We have that within us throughout history. This kind of hatred of the city, the kind of anarchicism. You see it in many forms, replicated throughout history, and you find it replicated in modern Lagos. If I could go back to Atiba Computer Village, this kind of place of dynamism and spontaneous order in Lagos, which is replicated in other ways by Nollywood, one of the second biggest film industry in the world. Nigerian fashions, Nigerian hip hop are all products of the street, but they all, what one Nigerian journalist calls the sort of disgrace of anarchy, which I would take as a compliment, but it's seen as a criticism. So the idea in Lagos is to take the kind of spontaneously emerging market of Atiba Computer Village and put it in an out-of-town business park, which you can bet any money would drain it of all its kind of creativity. But nonetheless, it's a desire amongst the authorities of Lagos to impose some kind of order on their city, to clear away the mess. And today, I mean, that again tells us another story about how we have a desire to sanitize cities. When I've talked about this book in many places around the world, I hear more commonly than not that cities have become very sanitized, very controlled places, and very boring places in a way. That public space is controlled a lot more. that a lot of the energies of cities, and I find that from my own experiences, the places I lived in London, the kind of places that made them bohemian and dynamic, then become a kind of magnet for commodification of those energies. It's a typical tale, I think, around the world, that there's been a desire to control the places like the Sudkerland in Berlin, which is a product of spontaneous vegetation growth, is very unusual in cities. The normal manifestation of nature in cities is the controlled public park. But we're waking up in an ecological sense to the idea of mess, to the idea of having ecologies within cities. Because what is the most important thing about what's the biggest threat to cities in the 21st century? It's the threat of climate change. And the idea of bringing nature back into the cities is becoming increasingly important. And that is because we're awakening to the fact that places like Sudkerland are more important than anywhere else, because those brownfield sites, those leftover sites, are so productive for nature. In the same way, we have lost a lot of the energies of our cities because those sort of primal energies have been contained. And the problem is not just an aesthetic one, it's a problem, I think, of resilience as well. There's resilience in the sense that we have to defend ourselves, our cities, from threats outside that we know not how they're going to present themselves. But it's nonetheless that the resilience of cities, like the resilience of nature, comes from spontaneity. It comes from self-generating communities, the ones I've talked about and how they manifested themselves throughout history. I've hurried through it. I know that because I want to get to the discussions. I think that will be important. But this sense of sharing a city, of having that intimacy, of having that space for the informal, the spontaneous, is the bedrock, really, of the urban history that I tell. And it's something that we're badly missing now. And I hope that this awakening to the ecological values of places like the Sudkerland, these sort of leftover places, sparks a new form of public space, a new way of inhabiting cities based around a kind of intersection of the two kinds of ecologies of cities, the human ecology of city and the natural ecology. Now, what I mean by this is, as we value our cities as places that can be at the forefront of a way to stop and arrest or mitigate climate change, is a way to bring back new public spaces that are based around the streets. So places like Amsterdam, Paris, Barcelona are removing cars from their streets, bringing vegetation into cities. Paris, with its 15-minute city idea that everything can be around you, implies a kind of sense of messiness, an end to the kind of zoning of cities, a separation of functions within a city, and to bring back that kind of ecosystem in a natural sense and a human sense that benefits us all. And that's why I started with Sudkerland, and that's why I'm ending it, because that is the intersection point, is this our sort of awakening idea of how our cities are so dependent on natural processes, and how natural processes can waken us to how cities can function as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Yeah, this theme about the tension between the messiness and spontaneity of city life, set against the desire for order and cleanliness. It's something I think urbanists worry about a lot. The culture of modern governance is so oriented to rules about how wide the road has to be, which is almost always too wide, and rules about what uses can go where, which is the zoning maps that most every city has, that prevent the mixing of uses and prevent or at least slow down the changing of uses over time. There's rules about everything, and they all have a reason, they all have a good reason, but the thicket of rules in total ends up suppressing the emergence of spontaneity in city life. I know your book, it's not a it's not a program for action the way a committee for Sydney report would be, but it really does inspire an attempt to maybe peel back some of those rules. Are there any cities that are getting that right today?
Well, some cities getting it right in surprising ways. I'd use the example of Los Angeles, which was built for was the sort of the zoning city, right? It was the antidote to the industrial city, where you would zone industry, retail, residential in ways that that were very different from the shock cities of the 19th century, such as Manchester or Chicago, where all those things were jumbled together and created horrendous social problems. Los Angeles, was the very white Anglo suburban city, and as it's become, I find Los Angeles a fascinating city to travel around. If you know a bit about the history, it has the same layers of history as a sort of older city where you'd expect to find history. And I found my tours around Los Angeles, involving hundreds of miles of driving, to be fascinating sort of tales of the 20th and 21st century. But suffice to say, as it has sort of as it's changed demographically and become a majority Latino city in this century, the Latino population's less prone to own a car, less likely to own a car, and want more to undo the intensely private nature of a suburban city and open houses out to the street. I'm sure lots of people know about this, have read about this kind of idea of Latino urbanism, which is to create public spaces in the way that I was talking about in this presentation. In a way, is to claim space for interaction, for the pleasures of food and markets and things like that. Now, Los Angeles banned street selling for a long time, and only retrospectively have they kind of decided to legalize it. So that's the way that planning catches up with what people are doing on the ground, and they're doing it in a very popular way. The kind of food trucks and markets attract young people who want to live in the city. It kind of creates a reverse effect of regentrification of some of those areas in a way, but nonetheless, it shows how compelling that idea of street culture in a city that never had street culture, and how public authorities sort of catch up on it, right? It's that way. Another city, historically, I'd talk about Tokyo being a city where a lot of as it recovered from the firebombing of the Second World War, a lot of the decision making was given to local communities. So it's a city that has grown incrementally from people on the ground making decisions in a very local way, within the constraints of within planning regulations. But the sort of modernization of Tokyo happened retrospectively around areas that were growing kind of from the kind of energies of the people that live there. I think somewhere like, another one that's sort of a favorite of urbanists is Medellin, which is in Colombia, which is a place where people, there's an attempt to connect the city, connect different parts of the city, and to give agency to people within the ground. I think the danger is following a sort of a Chinese model where communities are destroyed sort of on a daily basis and replaced with very rigorous top-down planning. My fear that that's the kind of thing in somewhere like Lagos that becomes a kind of something to emulate, rather than, and you see it all the time, the sort of hatred of the kind of the energies of the city. So there's lots of different ways of horror stories and things that give us kind of hope, I think.
Yeah, I suppose the lesson of those cities you mentioned is that we really need to look at the things that are prohibited, the things that are prescribed and proscribed, and understand and I suppose be very suspicious of them. So the building culture of Tokyo is so tolerant of eclectic architectural styles and densities and heights, and you can have a tall building next to a short building. Whereas if you were to go into a suburb of Sydney or most Western cities, people get quite upset about that. They want, if it's single family homes, they want to be next to other single family homes, and the sort of tolerance for a kind of eclectic expression of built form is quite low. And yeah, food trucks illegal in so many cities. Somehow in Los Angeles, they were just able to overwhelm the authorities, and eventually the authorities gave up and decided they could be legal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, and it extends to my sort of metaphor for the ecology as well, that the kind of the prim suburban lawn is an ecological nightmare. But suburbs can be incredibly ecologically, can give a lot of value to cities from an ecological point of view, because they have lots of unused space. If you can make, places beautiful. I think Sheffield's a good example of this, where there's a sort of planning regime that chooses plants that aren't necessarily natives, but do well in cities. And to plant, but have a high ecological productive value. So you get what looks like a meadow within an urban context, which is very jarring for people. The idea of nature in cities has always been very controlled. And it's a question of changing habits. And, you can have, in Los Angeles, for example, there was a famous case where a family tried to introduce native Californian plants to their garden, and they were told that they were turning the neighborhood into a slum. Because of this, as you said, this low tolerance for eclecticism extends to nature. But I think we can use space in very different ways, and I think that's the kind of the challenge is to see the value of those things, especially I'm thinking from an ecological point of view, but also from a social point of view, that all cities, and I use the LA example again, that so much has changed in a very short space of time in neighborhoods in Los Angeles. They have a history. It's a history that's connected in a lot of ways to the Cold War, to racial tensions in the United States. They tell their and to globalization. They all tell their stories, but they're not immune. None of them are immune. Suburbia kind of has a facade of unchanging kind of stasis, right? But behind the kind of net curtains and very prim lawns, there is a lot of change that happens, and we should recognize that. I think we should. Suburbia has its detractors, of course, and its kind of image in popular culture as being boring. But maybe if we kind of valued suburbs and told their stories in a slightly different way, then maybe we could be more radical in the way that we approach them.
All right, let me ask you about another tension, and I think this is the tension between cities as polyglot places that take in people from all over the world, set against the fear of the other that is alive and well. So your chapter on Cosmopolis, which centers on Athens and Alexandria, the opening sentence is: Singapore, New York, Los Angeles, Amsterdam, London, Toronto, Vancouver, Auckland, and Sydney have this in common. Between 35% and 51% of their residents are foreign-born. And you develop a chapter about cities as places that bring people from all over. How does that force, that element of cities interact with the countervailing force, the fear of too much immigration, that has animated movements like Brexit and equivalent movements in the United States and Australia, and indeed many countries?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I'm talking to you from the land of Brexit, so it's all too clear to me. Yeah, I think cities for all kinds of ways, and that's why I was trying to develop that idea of Babylon as the kind of the name that echoes down the ages as the city as a dangerous and sort of a profoundly alien and disruptive influence. You find that Jefferson talked in America. In America should never have European cities with their mess and their contagions and densities, because it was an agrarian society, and that's where the soul of the city lay. You find it again and again throughout history that the city is the kind of the enemy. I think we know today. You know, it manifests itself in lots of different ways, of course. So today you find it, I think, because we live in a world that's so dominated by a few superstar cities, and a lot of places that fall behind in the race, that you're bound to have that tension. You know, that has become the kind of the battleground in many societies, is that massive disparity in wealth. You know, I'm also talking to a country where London is so dominant over the rest of the country, and any attempts to rebalance it is always fraught for danger. You know, the Russian oligarchs don't want to go to anywhere apart from London or its surroundings. Or in America, sort of tension between Rust Belt cities, the left behind cities, the cities that once used to be so sort of dominant and seem like the cities of the future that fall behind. Then that causes inevitably, you know, resentments and desires for revenge. You know, a lot of people, you know, who voted for Brexit took some sort of glee in the way that London would suffer from it. And you know, that has been the feature of our age. As much as we talked about an urban renaissance, as much as we talked about an urban renaissance from the kind of, you know, late part of the 20th century and into the 21st, the urban renaissance was very concentrated in a few kind of lucky places. Now, one thing that the pandemic could potentially do is to release some of that energy to other cities. There's been plenty of talk about people going to other places for quality of life and affordability, now that they can work from anywhere rather than having to sort of crowd into very expensive financial centers. You know, there's a possibility of that people will choose to be digital nomads maybe and go to other cities. I mean, who knows? I don't really know. I think that you know, that sort of hoarding of power within cities brings immense sort of dangers to cities as well.
You know, the call of the urbanists in every country is always, please let us have our immigrants. Please let us be a free city where people can come, and you the anti-urbanists, you in the countryside can maintain your homogeneity if you don't want to have immigrants, but just let them come to the city. And somehow, of course, because cities are not city states, they are, with a couple of exceptions like Singapore, cities are always embedded within a national polity that is at times quite hostile to cities. They never get to set their own immigration policy. But certainly people in London felt Brexit as an assault on the essential values of London, just as people in New York City have felt that about some of the anti-immigrant national policies. Is there any way for cities to be polyglot places within a national polity that doesn't embrace that?
Well, I mean, they can and they do to a certain extent. That's, you know, cities have always had that that character about them, and they've been, you know, there's a great, you know, book about Chicago by one of the early Chicago schools, where they talked about the inner city being the tidelands of cities that are constantly washed through by new people coming in and inhabiting those spaces. And there's always, you know, cities always are hungry for people to come to them, I think, to a certain extent, and, you know, often in exploitative ways, but nonetheless, those tidelands are kind of, you know, continually kind of sort of changing, and it's an interesting way to look about cities, I think, as these kind of, you know, place of sort of impermanence. And, you know, again, I'm talking about, you know, I refer back to those kind of layers of history that are kind of created in cities. But, you know, will that tension ever end? No, I don't think it ever will. I think that's just sort of so baked into it. And
that's the human condition now.
There was a desire after Brexit that, you know, the next day there was the majority of Londoners wanted to sort of, you know, declare themselves a city state and stay in the EU, and that's just a fact. And there's always a tug of war, and it has its destructiveness, and it's city against country, it's city against suburb, or certain types of suburbs against city. That, you know, there's a continual tension, and maybe, you know, that's a good thing in a way, possibly, if you look at it in in a positive light. It ain't going to go away, and it's a kind of constant. London was always the great way, and it was the place of corruption and disease, which probably added to its allure to a certain extent.
Yeah. Ben, we were chatting before going live, and I know the book you've been working on during COVID is about nature in cities. I wonder if you can share your thoughts on, well, maybe two intertwined stories that you've been thinking about. Is COVID going to change anything fundamental about cities? But also, when you pay attention to nature in the city, what does that reveal about the way cities work?
Well, so let's do the second part of your question first. I think, what I've been working on is a history of the interaction between nature and cities, and often nature isn't talked about very much when you talk about, especially the sort of the deeper history of cities. It's often written out of the story. But of course, the way that a city interacts with its hinterland is crucial to how cities have historically developed. And a lot of that, that's to do with where you get your fuel from, where you get your water from, where you get your food from, and where you expel your waste. It's the sort of two-way process of city life. That London was interesting in that it was the most wooded area of the United Kingdom. Up until the 17th century, the cities needed huge forests on their peripheries. The counties around London were much more wooded than anywhere else. London created its own forest for sources of fuel and timber. And London was the first major city to lose its dependence on forests, and to get coal imported from the north of England. And what do you find then? The whole of those forests disappear in a way that they didn't happen in German cities. If you go to a German city, they're often surrounded by publicly owned forests because they didn't have an access to coal till much, much later, and then decided that their forests were good for culture and leisure, had an economic value in a different way. So that's what I'm trying to say there, is that relationship between city and nature does follow things that are very particular to countries. They follow changes in technologies, changes in fuel sources, and they can tell us a lot about how cities run by looking at their edges. I'm interested in the edges of cities. The edges of cities really fascinate me, what happens there and how that impacts on the center. I think urbanists are very kind of directed towards the center of cities. I sort of stalk around the edges, sort of, trying to find the stories that I find there. And nature sort of, that's the interaction between city and nature is interesting, and our relationship with it, and how we went from a sort of position of celebrating it, how cities were places where you didn't need parks because you could walk out of the city into kind of wildernesses, which was certainly the case in European cities until they began to expand. And that changes our relationship with nature, and it changes because we begin to fear nature. It becomes a source of pollution and disease, and animals become a thing that you have to throw out of cities. So cities used to be a kind of part farmyard. They used to be absolutely full of animals, and then they had to be removed. And the animals have only just been coming back in a different way during the second half of the 20th century, partly because of the way we've suburbanized. So I think sort of telling the story from the inside out, which is what I'm essentially trying to do by writing about nature and cities, is also to tell a different way about how cities develop and the impact that has on the natural world. And we're becoming much more attuned to the fact that we need, nature, green infrastructure to protect ourselves and mitigate against the effects of climate change. So that tells another story. Things like gardens, are changing garden habits, our kind of eclecticism for different kinds of plants from around the world makes the cities very kind of interesting in a botanical kind of way, because they have many more species than the countryside, because we sort of pack them full of exotics and sort of the weird and the wonderful, and change our fashions. Sometimes we want exotic, sometimes we want natives, and so cities, the nature of cities is as volatile and changeable as the human population of cities. There's this sort of constant change. It never stands still. Nature manifests itself so differently and so kind of revolutionary as we change the microclimate of cities, as we change our habits and aesthetic preferences. There's this kind of dynamism in the natural world that kind of mirrors completely our trade and our wealth and our changing populations in cities and our changing use of buildings and space. And our changing preoccupations with, our desire and need for the natural world. To go back to the first part of the question, how a city is going to change as a result of the pandemic. Well, the jury's still out on that. But I think one of the things I was thinking about whilst we were in lockdowns was our changing relationship with our neighborhoods. And I kind of think that, as we work from home more, as we kind of experience and have a greater need for our environment in our local bit, then maybe we want some of the things that were traditionally in the center of towns in our neighborhoods, and that would be no bad thing. And that's very much to the point of the Parisian idea of the 15-minute city, of having things that are close to you. And I've noticed this in the UK, that suddenly, almost not quite overnight, but within the first few weeks and months of lockdowns, that places that were completely bereft, and the kind of outer rims of cities bereft of coffee shops and butchers and greengrocers and film clubs and all the things you used to go to the central city for on the basis, were coming out to neighborhoods. And that's kind of what I think is really important about how we urbanize in the 21st century is becoming more urban, in the sense that we extend the idea of urbanization to suburban districts, make them more dense, make them more urban and more sustainable in that way, from a community and an environmental perspective as well.
Yeah, that's a very hopeful.
Yeah, I'm an optimistic person.
Very hopeful idea of what could be happening as a result of COVID.
Well, it is happening in places, but I think it needs to be extended further. And I think, cities that have been really kind of proactive, and Amsterdam's a really good example. It took the opportunity of COVID to completely rethink its position within the natural environment, and to have very ambitious plans to become a self-sufficient circular economy by the middle part of the century, and to cut its dependence on fossil fuels. And all this happened during the time of pandemic, when people were focused on their local area and what could augment urban life at a time when we were kind of imprisoned within it. So I think although I think most of those lessons, and we'll forget them pretty soon and move back on to the next thing. There is a chance that that we could value the idea of green space within cities when we've been trapped in it so much. Why shouldn't we? I think they've become things that we know are essential to our mental and physical health, and when we're deprived of access to them, we need them on our doorstep.
Right. I suppose the thing is, changing as a result of the pandemic is it's not an inevitability. It's not an external force. It's an opportunity for us to make changes if we choose to. And so we have to, and that's why we see some cities have really made big changes in the last 2 years, and others have not. And I'd like to think that Sydney is still deciding whether it wants to make some changes. All right, Ben, we're out of time. Thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts with us. Everybody, well, you can't see this, but it's a great book, Metropolis, A History of the City, Humankind's Greatest Invention. Can't wait to see your next book, and hopefully we'll have you back.
It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.